So now we get to the fun part, which is the archetype families. So we talked about the survival archetypes, which we all have, but then there are some families that we can sort of slot different specific archetypes beneath, sort of like umbrella terms. So while there are infinite archetypes, we can file most of those archetypes into categories, and these categories will grow and grow and grow. And these are some of the names that I use. I've borrowed from Carolyn Miss. I've borrowed from some other scholars that we'll talk about at the end of this to create these lists. But you can start to create your own lists. And I would recommend grabbing a pen and a piece of paper if you don't already have it, because you're going to notice that some archetypes pop out to you as we go through these lists together. Write them down and just notice what's popping out for you. We also have a tendency to only write down the things that we're attracted to, like, I don't know, the intellectual or the CEO or the entrepreneur, and to be extremely repulsed and not want to write down the other archetypes that pop out to us that maybe are not so flattering. And I want to urge you to write everything down. So anything that sort of like strikes you and raises your hackles up, note it. You don't need to judge it. You don't need to do anything about it, but just note it. Okay? Good? All right. Okay, so we're going to talk about 6 archetype families today. So the first one is the feminine and masculine, which, like, let's admit that's a bit dated, right? We know that gender is not a binary structure, but that's what we're going to call it, the feminine and masculine archetype, just because we're going to be using terms like queen and king. You can be a queen and be a non-gender binary person or a female identifying person. You can have archetypal aspects of the queen, and you don't have to be a female identifying person. Vice versa for the sort of like masculine words that we're going to use. I know many examples of female identifying people who have major king energy, but that's the family we're going to talk about. The divine family, which the nun is one of the people in the divine family. The wisdom family, the healer family, the creative family. Steve Jobs is a great example of actually many archetypes on the creative family. The action family, we've got Sherlock Holmes here. We'll talk about the detective in a little bit. And then the wild card, which is sort of like the archetypes that are more difficult for us to sort of slot underneath these umbrella terms. Okay, so the feminine / masculine sort of archetype family. Some examples would be the queen, the goddess, the mother, the princess, and the damsel, which are 2 sort of like nuanced versions of a similar archetype. The virgin, the king, the knight, the prince, the father, the warrior, the fool, and the Don Juan. The Don Juan would, like be someone who would be romantic or romance women, or men, whichever. So a lot of these archetypes are what we grow up with in our childhood, as you probably can imagine. That really affects how we view gender identity. I know when I was growing up, my dad called me princess all the time. And he definitely didn't call me warrior or little knight or little prince, which is so interesting. So I want you to just think about, like, what have you been called maybe in your life and what rubbed you the wrong way? I personally hated it when my dad called me princess. I thought it was one of the most annoying things ever. I love my father, my very Italian father, but I hated that because I had a really negative connotation with the word princess. You're maybe thinking it in your mind right now, someone who's snooty and has her nose stuck up and is too good for other people and who's delicate and likes the color pink. And I was none of those things growing up. So identify maybe what are some of the archetypes that are coming up for you here. Feel free to pop into the chat. So our next category is the divine category. This obviously has everything to do with the next realm, the spiritual. So in the divine category, a lot of it has to do with specifically religion, which is an interesting sort of like nuance compared to the wisdom category, which has more mysticism in it. So the divine would look at things like the monk, the nun, the shaman, the priest or priestess, the disciple, the martyr, the Samaritan, the missionary. That is a very loaded term. The angel, the god, the goddess, the messiah, the holy fool. The holy fool we see in tarot, right? Tarot is a beautiful example of just a deck of archetypes. Does anyone resonate with any of the divine archetypes? I know that I've certainly been a martyr before. I don't actually have any of the divine archetypes in my personal archetype wheel, but I can think of off the top of my head, like someone who I'm very close with who totally has that nun archetype in her, and acts like, is like basically all the divine archetypes. Samaritan and shaman, the devotee, that's a really good one. Devotee or nun would be a good example. Disciple, I think, can be close to devotee. I think of the healer when I think of my divine. The healer is actually its own category, which we'll get into in a second. What is an angel? I mean, can you think of an earth angel? I know that I can think of one. My grandmother is a perfect example of that. She was literally the most kind, gentle, angelic human being. I have a picture of her over there on my altar. Maybe can someone else think of a couple words that they would associate with someone who's an angel or like an earth angel, what that energy is like or what it feels like? If you could pop it in the chat, that would be dope. I'm going to take a drink of my Olipop now. Sent from above. Ooh, Lisa, realizing I have some resistance against goddess. Yes. Gentle and loving makes you feel loved. Protector, ethereal. Yes. Perfect. See, you guys are great. Sorry, I want to stop saying guys when I'm just talking to groups of people. So I'm just trying to watch myself there. Sorry about that. You all are great at figuring out archetypes, right? This is innate to us. We know how to do this, which is why it's so cool. And you are gonna have such a hard time not seeing archetypes in people after this. Okay, the next category is the wisdom category. So a little bit different than the divine, right? We've got the mystic, the teacher, the student, the guide, the mentor, the philosopher, the sage, the crone, the seeker, the hermit, the alchemist, the storyteller, the judge. I've got the judge, mediator, magician, spellcaster, witch. The difference between the divine and the wisdom is that the divine is really moved by religion and form. The wisdom archetype is more in search of wisdom, right? Information, no matter where it comes from. And that can mean it comes from a book. That can mean it comes from a teacher. That can mean it comes from experiences, which is the seeker archetype. That can mean that it comes from heaven or somewhere else, right? The witch or the spellcaster or the magician. Does anyone resonate with any of the wisdom archetypes? I know that the holisticism community in general is pretty like locked into the wisdom archetype. Are there any seekers or self-identifying seekers in here? Seeker, magician, definitely philosopher, seeker. Yeah, 100%. Magician, alchemist, witch, love that. And the thing is, like, we probably are going to look at these archetypes and we'll be like, oh yeah, I've definitely been that at one part in my life, right? Like I remember when I was like straight up seeker all the time. And I don't have that archetype in my wheel. It's not a through line in my entire life, but it certainly was an aspect of my life. And when we can sort of isolate and be like, oh yeah, when I was 25, I was 100% like the student, right? Or, oh yeah, when I was in my early 30s, I was totally the guide. But I'm not really that anymore. That's when we can sort of like isolate an archetypal journey. And so we can just put a pin in that, think about that, you know, as you're working through this yourself, like, interesting that when I was going through that, like I really resonated with that archetype at that point in my life, but not so much anymore. I wonder what archetypal journey that is. And you can start to create them yourself and just, you know, hindsight is 2020. We can connect the dots with hindsight, as Steve Jobs says. So the next archetype family is the healer archetype, which is it's actually much smaller, but I'm sure that we could probably come up with a lot more archetypes in this little group. So examples of the healer are the healer, straight up, the rescuer, the servant, the slave, the caretaker, and the companion. Does anyone identify with any of the healer archetype? I'm positive that we're going to see some. Healer, yeah. Find the magic in our past, exactly. What's the difference between the spellcaster and the witch? I think I would think about that, but for me personally, someone who casts spells is kind of just in things to control other people, right? They're just using spells, as opposed to a witch, witching is a lifestyle. But really, like witches have, from my perspective, and the way that I view that archetype, they have a divine practice, and they have a lot of respect for magic. And they're not just using spells to get what they want. They are tending to their garden and using herbs and treating others and thinking about how magic has an equal and opposite reaction whenever we bring it into play or we call it in. As a healthcare worker, I feel major healer vibes. Yeah. And you might have, some of you have already noticed this. You might have multiple archetypes from an archetypal family. You might notice that all your archetypes are from one archetypal family. I tend to be very much in the wisdom category. I love to learn. I'm a student, I'm a teacher. Those are like some of my main archetypes. So maybe if you're a caretaker, you might feel like, oh yeah, sometimes I'm also a slave and a servant. So that's interesting. Or maybe like I fall more into, we could even add like the mother into this archetype, right? So many of us have mothers who are healers, and like that's the energy, that's the like divine mother energy that we're seeking. I resonate as a healer, but don't vibe with these terms. Trying to think of others that would be more relatable. Yeah. Oh yeah. If you don't vibe with it, that's totally cool too. I think, Karen, I'm a mother who's a healer. You certainly are. And you're also very, very specifically each of those, right? So sometimes they can overlap, they can have shades, but sometimes they're also really specific and separate. I think like practitioner may also be on this healer sort of place. I would also view seer as a mystic or as a healer. Seer as opposed to like seeker. Okay. All right. Our next category is the creative category. This is pretty much exactly what you'd think. Artist or starving artist. Those are, that's a discernment between two archetypes. The writer, the dancer, the musician, the pioneer, the explorer, the strategist, the politician, the networker, the shapeshifter, the entrepreneur, the CEO, the visionary, the dilettante, the hacker. The creative archetype isn't just someone who's making things with their hands necessarily. The creative is creating a new world. So anyone who is responsible for that, for envisioning a new world and creating a new world, we could call into the creative archetype. Does anyone identify with any of the creative archetypes? I know we've got a lot of entrepreneurs and CEO energy in this room for sure. Any shapeshifters in here? A shapeshifter would be someone who is really good at code switching or jumping between being two things, right? Being like super intellectual and also really intuitive. The networker, I noticed that some people said networker. A great example of a networker is someone who's good at connecting people. It's not necessarily like someone who like loves to go to parties and loves to be the center of attention or a social butterfly. A network, think of what a network does. It's literally connecting two things. So many of you, if you are like CEO or entrepreneur and that doesn't identify with who you are, you might be a networker and your job is to connect. A dilettante is someone who likes to, Lily asked what a dilettante is. A dilettante is someone who sort of like loves to dabble in things and never really is an expert in anything. Sort of can like, talk about something at parties as if they've really studied it for a long time, but never really masters it. And so as a result, they flip from thing to thing to thing. Oh my gosh, I'm a dilettante too. Yeah, right? That's... Okay, lots of dilettantes. I love that. And okay, why would that be a good thing to know? Because then if we're like, oh yeah, fuck, yeah, that's me. Then you don't feel like, well, do I like have to get my PhD in this thing that I'm really interested in? Like, do I have to go take a million classes and study and become an expert? Oh wait, no, I can just like be interested in what I'm interested in when I'm interested in it. And like, no shame and no shade. Cool. I love that. All right. On to the next. So our next family is the action family. This is easy. These are like the center of the story to me. The hero or the heroine, the coward and the bully, the mercenary, the gambler, the rebel, the destroyer, the detective, the advocate, the social justice warrior, that's a relatively new one, the avenger, the pirate, and the sovereign. The sovereign would be like a ruler. Which is different than a king or a queen, right? They have different flavor. Does anyone identify with any of these? I will tell you a lot of my archetypes are in the action archetype. I've got hella detective energy. I've also got hella rebel energy in me. And within these different archetypes too, there are nuances. So within the rebel, there's like the anarchist rebel, right? There's the rebel without the cause. There's the social act, like the social action rebel. There's the feminist, which is a form of a rebel or a form of an advocate. So does anyone identify with any of that? I mean, I think many of us are going through and experiencing advocacy, and that, like the social justice warrior, maybe it's not our primary archetype or even in our archetype wheel, but we're going through an archetypal journey right now, right? Where maybe we're like more of a dilettante, or maybe we were more sort of like paying attention to ourselves and our communities, caretaking within our community. And now we're stepping out and we're becoming advocates, and we're stepping into the advocacy role. And what comes next is really important. What's the next archetype that we're going to walk into if things begin to calm down, if we decide we don't want to dedicate our lives to social action or social justice? How are we going to continue to hold that flame and hold that vision as we step into the next part of this journey? Where's the archetype wheel you speak of? Good question, Megan. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this class, and I'm going to teach a full other class on it because it's